"Who is your father, little one?" he asked, quiet enough to be mistaken for the wind. The girl looked up with mud on her knees and a stare that had learned to count days. He was Edward Hale, known in the city for towers of glass, philanthropic wings, and a name on every finance page. But that afternoon at the open market, under a hot sun and a blue tarpaulin sagging with sweat, he saw something that stopped his breath. It was a pendant on a frayed cord, a small silver lily with a nick at the base, the same pendant his mother had worn in a photograph he had never truly looked at until now. Dust rose with every step. A vendor shouted prices in a sharp rhythm. The smell of grilled fish and jasmine rose from an alley stall, and the pendant flashed like an accusation. He stepped out of his black car slowly, shoes scuffing gravel, and the world felt both too loud and painfully still. He reached for a question, and the question became a promise to himself. He would find out where that pendant had been all these years. The market was a patchwork of voices and colors. Baskets of mangoes glowed, chickens pecked, a radio played an old love song thin with static. Edward moved through it like a man trying to remember the tune of his life. He stopped in front of the girl who clutched the pendant. Her name was Lily, her hair tied back with a red ribbon, her clothes patched at the elbows. He watched her fingers worry the cord as if calming a small animal. "Where did you get that?" he asked. She blinked and answered, "I found it on the ground." He crouched, the leather of his suit warm against the sun, and saw the nick at the base of the silver lily, as if it were a scar that belonged to both of them. Around them, Miguel the mango seller shifted in his stall and called out to a passing customer. Rosa the seamstress paused her sewing to glance, and old Mrs. Duarte sipped bitter coffee while watching the scene. He asked for a name, and the name fell from her lips like a pebble. Edward felt his heart tighten. He handed her a coin, more than it should have been, and in the jar of exchanged money and eyes, he felt the first thread of responsibility pull. "Are you alone?" he asked, and Lily looked away, wind lifting a strand of hair across her forehead. "My mom is here," she said, nodding toward a squatted woman sorting vegetables. The woman was Maria, small and quick, with a face that had known storms. Edward introduced himself awkwardly, as if names could bridge decades, and offered to buy them dinner. Maria hesitated, the knife in her hand catching sunlight, and said no at first. "We are fine," she replied, voice rough but steady. Edward persisted gently. "Please, let
me do this. Call it a thank you." He handed over a bag, the paper rustling with rice and a wrapped chicken. The sound of the bag became a small ceremony. Around them, Carlos, his driver, watched from a distance, frowning at the exchange, while Anna, the assistant, recorded the encounter on her phone with a professional distance that made Edward feel exposed. He lingered, watching Lily open the parcel with surprise and the smell of cumin and orange peel filling the air. The pendant lay against her chest, cold and real. For a moment, the market narrowed to the sound of Lily's breath and the faint rattling of the pendant against an old tin cup. Edward decided to find out more, and followed them, after a pause that felt like a held breath. He asked directions from Tom, the stall owner who sold inexpensive toys, and from Sarah, a schoolteacher who was drawing a chalk circle for children. The path led through a narrow alley of corrugated roofs and laundry on lines. He moved quietly, aware of his shoes, as if they were intruders in this lane of life. At the doorway of a small house, paint flaking like old skin, Maria shut the door with a hand that trembled only slightly. "You should go," she said to Edward, and closed it again, but a small window remained open. He stood there, listening to the scrape of a wooden chair, the distant barking of a dog, the scent of boiled sweet potato and bleach. He knocked. A child's laugh, brittle but bright, came through. A neighbor, Jorge, called from across the way and warned that the family had no use for charity. Edward persisted, and the conversation at the doorstep unfolded in careful layers. "Why do you care?" Maria asked. "Because I think that pendant belonged to someone I loved," he answered. "Prove it," she said, and he left, with a promise and a card and the echo of a closed door. That night, he returned with careful hands and a simple box of gifts. The city lights made the puddles glitter, and the smell of exhaust mixed with fried dough as he parked. He carried the box like a small offering, more nervous than any boardroom presentation. Inside were pencils, a blanket, a second pendant that was an inexpensive copy he hoped would not offend but rather comfort. He rang the bell. Maria opened with caution. "We don't want charity," she said again, but her voice cracked when Lily ran forward and hugged his knees, smelling of soap and old cloth. Edward looked at Maria, at the lines around her eyes, at the small bandage on her thumb. He introduced Eleanor, a friend of his who volunteered at shelters, and she explained a program for school books and health checks. "We can help with tuition," Eleanor said softly, her voice a fabric of empathy. Maria listened, fingers twisting the corner of a faded dish towel, and then she sighed.
"If you are offering something honest, we will accept," she said. The little house smelled of boiled beans and lavender soap. The floor was cool under his shoes, and the pendant at Lily's throat seemed to pulse with an old light. A memory surfaced like a photograph left in rain. Edward remembered a rainy night years ago when his mother had wrapped a child in blankets and pressed a tiny silver lily into a small hand. He remembered promising to never forget that look. The flashback lasted barely a breath, but it was dense with detail. The rain was heavy, a metallic chorus on the roof. There had been the taste of cheap tea and the sharp scent of hospital antiseptic. His mother had whispered a name into the dark, and he had promised a future that his younger self could not yet hold. That past explained the pendant and left a wound that never fully healed. He told a shortened version to Anna and Carlos later, voice low and factual, while the office lights hummed and the city slept. They listened, Mark the investor calling with questions about quarterly returns halfway through the story, Veronica, his fiancée, texting about a charity gala the next week, and Dr. Evans, the family physician, leaving a voicemail reminding him about his own checkup. The past was a thin thread now connecting to the present in a way that tugged at his conscience. Over the following weeks, a routine grew. Edward would visit the lane with a bag and a small plan. He taught Lily how to use a geometry compass. He read aloud a weathered book until his voice was hoarse, and he showed Maria how to access a clinic. Each visit was rich with sensory detail that grounded him. He learned the crisp way the laundry smelled after midday sun, the rough texture of Lily's homework paper, the metallic clang of a neighbor's bicycle, the sweetness of boiled plantain offered as thanks, and the echo of laughter bouncing off corrugated roofs at dusk. Meanwhile, the world he had left behind pushed back. Veronica called, frustration in her voice, asking why he spent afternoons in a neighborhood that would be at the gala as a charity case next week. "You are spending time where reputations get complicated," she said. Mark the investor sent a text about a hostile bid and deadlines at the office. Anna warned that the press had started to notice his unannounced appearances. "They smell a story," she said, eyes narrow, and Carlos shrugged and said he would keep the car ready. The names and faces multiplied. There was Tom, the stall owner, who brought mangoes when Lily was ill, Rosa, the seamstress, who mended Lily's jacket, Miguel, who gave the girl a free cup of broth, Jorge, who fixed a leaking roof beam, Sarah, the teacher who offered tutoring, and Nurse Paula at the clinic who checked Lily's scraped knee. Each person mattered, and their small acts became the scaffolding of something larger. Tension deepened one evening when Veronica confronted him in the study of his high-rise, the city lights like a trembling sea beyond the windows. The house smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. "You promised me we would get married next month," she said, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "I promised a life we planned," Edward replied, fingers pressed into the leather of his chair. The conversation became a volley. "You cannot split yourself," Veronica said. "I am not splitting," he answered. "I am trying to be honest." She slammed a folder of invitations on the table. The rustle echoed like thunder. "Your reputation is at stake," she said. "My conscience is at stake," he answered. Their exchange lasted and stretched, and within it the names of others surfaced. Mark called, breathless about a potential investor, and Anna texted a photo of a reporter whose shadow now lurked by the lane. The clashing textures of his worlds were sensory in their own right, the crispness of Veronica's silk, the stale air of the office, the thin paper of Lily's homework. Edward felt the pressure of expectations like a physical weight. He had to choose between the life of boards and ballrooms and the small, fragile claim of a girl with a pendant. The turning point came unexpectedly on a rain-spattered Saturday. A social media post by a local blogger had already looped the city into gossip about a billionaire visiting a poor lane. Reporters arrived, their cameras clicking like a rain of small machines. Maria stood at the doorway, palms on the wood, while Lily clutched the pendant and looked at Edward with a trust he felt unworthy of. Veronica arrived, not elegant this time, but furious, followed by Mark and by a local journalist named Peter who pushed a recorder forward. The lane filled with the sound of camera shutters, an excited murmur, the distant barking of a dog, the scent of wet earth, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. A heated exchange ensued between Edward and Veronica in front of the whole street. "What are you trying to prove?" she demanded. "I am trying to be a part of what I ignored," he replied. Lily stepped between them, small and trembling. "He is kind," she said, simply, and the clarity of that sentence cut through the noise. Then Anna produced an old photograph she had found in an archive, yellowed and folded. It showed Edward as a boy, his mother with the same silver lily pendant handing it to a small child. The recognition hit like a tide. Maria cried out, not in accusation, but in recognition, and Tom and Rosa and Miguel gathered as witnesses. The air smelled of rain and something older than gossip. The reveal that followed demanded confessions, papers, and a telephone call that would change everything. Maria and Edward sat at the tiny table under a drooping light bulb. He had brought a copy of a birth certificate and a letter from a hospital clerk named Nurse Paula, who remembered a delivery 20 years ago. Dr. Evans, who had treated his family, called and verified a name. Anna held the photograph steady, and Jorge produced a faded receipt for a small silver repair done years ago with the same nick described in it. There were 6 exchanges of questions and answers between them that felt like prayers. "Was she from my family?" Edward asked, voice low. "I cannot be certain," Maria replied, "but the pendant was given to my sister once," she added. "My sister died when Lily was small," Maria said, tears carving clean paths down her cheeks. "I kept it to feel close to her," she whispered. "I never knew its origin." Edward's hands trembled as he listened. The community named themselves into the record. Nurse Paula promised to look in old ledgers, Peter promised to wait before publishing, and Veronica stood back, her expression unreadable. A message arrived on his phone from an unknown number. A woman named Isabel, claiming to be a relative, asking for a meeting. The street seemed to hold its breath. The story did not end with answers, but with decisions. Edward offered to fund Lily's schooling and to pay for repairs to the roof that leaked in the rain. He promised Maria a regular stipend and set up a medical checkup with Dr. Evans scheduled for the next week. The neighbors Anna, Tom, Rosa, Miguel, Jorge, Sarah, and Nurse Paula became part of a plan to create a stable routine for Lily. Yet the phone would not stop ringing. Veronica spoke finally with a softness that surprised him. "I want honesty," she said. He answered honestly, and she asked for time. Mark negotiated quietly with his board, while Peter the reporter agreed to wait for documents. Isabel called with a calm voice and an accusation wrapped in longing, asking for proof of a connection that might make or break the new arrangement. Edward sat on the low stoop, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground, Lily asleep on his shoulder, the pendant warm against his chest like a small truth. He felt the pull of 2 cities in his bones, the pull of obligation and of possibility. He had promised himself to protect what he had discovered, and yet the world he belonged to demanded swift decisions. Before the final papers could be signed, a last twist arrived. A DNA test that Dr. Evans helped facilitate returned a result that complicated everything. It was not a simple confirmation, but a possibility with margins and qualifiers. But it suggested a connection that was strong enough to change plans and fragile enough to require care. Messages flooded in from lawyers, from Isabel insisting on a private meeting, from Veronica wondering if trust could be rebuilt. The community gathered for an emergency meeting outside the little house. Miguel brought soup, Rosa embroidered a new patch for Lily's plan.
Jacket, Tom offered to teach Lily how to fold paper boats. Anna organized a fundraiser, and Nurse Paula set up a follow-up at the clinic. They debated, they argued, they cried. Edward listened, and in the listening he found the shape of his choice. He would not let headline hunger make the decision for him. He would choose the slower, quieter path that honored the child's well-being over the city's appetite for drama. So what would you do if you were in his place? Would you sign the papers quickly to protect your name, or would you sit on the stoop and let the community decide what was best for the child? Comment below with your answer. Write "I would stay" or "I would leave" and tell us why. Subscribe if you want to follow every step of this unfolding story and to see what happens when wealth meets a promise buried in a pendant. Sometimes the hardest truths arrive wrapped in the smallest things. Sometimes the heart remembers before the hands do.